principle we're going to cover is directly observe work as activities, connections, and flows. Now, that's a mouthful, but let's start with some of the basic behaviors that accompany this principle. The starting one for me is suspend your assumptions. Don't go into whatever activity you apply this principle to believing you already understand what's real. Suspend your assumptions, put them aside, and go in with an open mind. The next part of this, from a behavioral standpoint, is to go and see. Actually get up out of your chair, out of your office, out of whatever is a comfortable place, and get uncomfortable. Get to the point of activity and go understand what's actually happening. Now, part of that also is a phrase that's commonly used called gemba. Now, gemba is a Japanese word meaning actually most commonly used as crime scene. But it's referred to as the real place, the real facts, the real data. And that's key. We try to avoid as much jargon as possible, and so I won't use the word gemba, but when people are referring to gemba, it often means directly observed work. And finally, be curious about cause and effect. It's not just enough to go see what actually occurred, but why. Understand cause and effect, and a large part of Lean ultimately comes down to understanding why you're getting the results that you are. So part of directly observed work is being curious about why. Be curious about cause and effect. The second part of this, beyond directly observed work, is as activities, connections, and flows. Now, the key part of this is that this is a framework through which to observe. Now, you can use other frameworks, and most scientific study, as an example, begins with a framework to be able to classify what you're observing. This is important so that you don't just end up with a bunch of random observations, but you actually end up with conclusions. You can actually understand the system that you're looking at. A good analogy of this is the difference between bird watching and watching birds. So I might sit in my backyard and watch birds, and if someone's shown me a bird before and I know exactly what it is, I might remember what that bird is. But bird watching has a structure to it, a framework to it. It involves the environment, where the bird sits, the shape of the feathers, the shape of the tail, the shape of the beak. There's a methodology, a framework by which you digest what you observe. And it allows bird watchers to ultimately understand hundreds of different birds. So the difference between simply enjoying what you see and understanding it is often having some kind of framework to digest and classify what you see. As it comes to understanding our processes, that classification is going to be activities, connections, and flows. Now, if you want to understand more about activities, connections, and flows, we suggest you watch the Lean Work Design, where we go into what activities, connections, and flows mean in much greater detail. One of the important reasons for having this classification is that it helps us observe in a granular way. What that means is we want to get into the details, past the broad strokes, and understand the fine details of what's actually happening. Now, this is important because this is where most of the opportunity is. The opportunity often is not in the broad strokes. It is in the fine details. If your check engine light comes on, that tells you that you have a problem, but tells you very little about what to do about it. You have to get into understanding all the different elements of how that engine works to get down to that one point of failure. So when we observe a process, we don't want to just get the version of the check engine light to understand that there's something broken in the process. We want to find that point of failure or that point of opportunity, and that happens at a granular level. The only way we can understand cause and effect is to directly observe work at a granular level, and that's how we drive improvement. So, as we talk about methods for directly observing work, there's lots of tools and approaches that you can take. We'll start with just the idea of go and see. Go out into the real work and observe. It doesn't always have to be a process map. You just might make notes of things that you see that need to be fixed. We worked with one organization, quite large, that had what they called Walkout Wednesday. The idea was to get up out of your office, walk out into the real work, which was distributed across a large region, and engage and understand what's really going on for people. The other is simply draw a picture. It doesn't have to actually be an official, formal tool. Draw a picture. And particularly if you use the terminology of activities, connections, and flows, you will inherently capture a system. When you start trying to draw a picture, it's actually much easier to draw a picture of a process or a system than it is to tell a story about it. And so if you start drawing a picture, you'll find yourself getting closer to cause as opposed to outcomes. And then there's a whole slew of different process mapping tools that you can use, from activity maps, which have their origins from activity-based costing, product process maps, which looks at the workflow. Put those together and you get what most people call a swim lane map. People have drawn spaghetti diagrams, particularly in operations, to show the work of the flow of people and of material. Or value stream mapping, which is quite popular to really see the flows and the connections across an operation. Now, I don't really care about the methodology of these tools. What's fundamentally important is that you approach them with the idea that you are trying to learn. For example, when you take process maps and you delegate it to, say, an intern to go build a process map, there's no learning that occurs. You end up with a map. But the map isn't really what was the point of it. It was the learning while building the map that really generates the ideas and opportunities to learn. So don't take shortcuts in this process. Understand that it is a discovery process, and how you approach it makes all the difference in the world. There's some following tips on how you approach directly observing work that are important to follow. First is have a purpose. Don't just wander out and explore. Know why you're going out. Are you looking for burden of work that people have to face? Are you looking for safety issues? Are you looking for concerns that customers might have? Why are you going out? It will help you focus your observation and know what you're trying to accomplish. Second, be patient. It can take a long time for the lessons to start to unfold in front of you. I once spent time in a hospital doing direct observation, and a problem that had existed for 2 years. We stood in a hallway watching the flow of patients for 4 hours. Now, 4 hours sounds like a very long time to observe, but what unfolded in that time was the key lessons that made it quite easy to solve a 2-year-old problem. And so, while the time relative to the 2 years was very small, in that moment, that time spent observing seemed like a massive investment. But it required that patience to see what was actually going on. Next, document what you see. This is really important to have some way to document. You don't want to just go out, observe, go back, and then say, I think this is what I saw. We all have an overly optimistic view of how good our memory of those details actually are. An example of this is there was a criminology professor in a university, and during his class, he staged a mugging. Someone ran in, mugged him, and ran out. And then he asked everybody to immediately write a witness statement of what they saw. On average, they only got about half of the facts right, and that was immediately after the event. His lesson was, for criminology, take witness statements as quickly as possible and as many of them as you can. But for our direct observation lesson, document what you see as you see it. The next point is validate what you see. You may think you saw something, but you don't understand why it's that way. You might not understand how often. You might have just not observed the normal condition, but an anomaly that happens once in a lifetime. So talk to the people in the process. Confirm your observations with what they experience each and every day. And lastly, don't rush to fix. While you're observing, focus on observing. You'll shortcut the learning if you try to rush to fix in the moment too quickly. Now, there's an exception to this, certainly understanding when there's a safety issue, for example, that you do need to fix right away. But if you know why you're out there, don't circumvent your learning process to try to rush to a solution in the moment. If you take these tips with you, regardless of what method you choose to do your direct observation, you're much more likely to be successful in the real point, which is to have a clear understanding of the current state of how things work.